Okay, great. I think just before we kick off, I'm going to ask everybody to just a quick introduction, just to let us know who we are interviewing today. So please, maybe if you can start, Pat, that will be great.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, Handel. Thank you so much for having us on your podcast today. My name is Pat Lipovski. I'm the founder and CEO of the Envision Group, and the Envision Group is we're really a group of former executives and consultants that have bonded together for the benefit of organizations around the world on different topics. But myself, I live in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and literally don't spend a lot of time under normal circumstances at home, but have been traveling around the world for the last 23 years, doing leadership support, strategy consulting, and now a little bit of financial private equity work with Bob Peterson, and you'll find out more from him in just a moment. So thanks for having me on the call. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Great. Bob, over to you.
Yeah, as Pat said, Bob Peterson, I'm a senior partner in the Envision Group. I've been in the energy industry about 40 years. Did my first career with Mobil, ExxonMobil, and then Schlumberger, and then went off into the management consulting world. And as Pat said, about 3 years ago, I joined a private equity firm in Houston as well. So I'm working with both Fieldstone Partners and with the Envision Group on strategy, funding strategy, and strategy execution. And as we'll discuss, increasingly, we're getting involved in strategy and funding projects that are entwined with ESG.
Great, thank you. Dr. Hugh, you can give us a quick intro on yourself as well, please.
Yes, not a problem. Good morning, everyone. My name is Hugh Dunleavey. I've primarily worked in the airline industry for about 40 years. First got to know Pat when I brought him in to work with me at one of the airlines in Calgary, and then later brought him in to work with me with the team in Malaysia, where I was Chief Commercial Officer at Malaysia Airlines. And I've been working with Pat for the past 3 or so years, working on strategy, people development, leadership skills, etc., and basically applying all the knowledge I learned in working in the airline business in different countries, different continents, and applying it so that we can be of assistance to companies. So that's what I've been doing, and I'll hand it back to you now.
Awesome, thank you. So any one of you can take this next question. Just give us a bit of an overview of who exactly is Envision.
Well, I'll start that off, Bob, and then I'll hand it to you and Hugh. It's so the Envision Group, again, as I mentioned, we're a group of former executives, accomplished executives and consultants that we spend time doing 3 primary items. We do strategy work with different companies, and not just strategy at the high end. We've got a bit of a uniqueness to us in that we do strategy alignment, and we do a bottom-up engagement of strategy to really lift organizations in all the best ways. With that requires some sense of strategy, leadership support for strategy. So we've done leadership training, leadership coaching, executive training, but it all lends to to the whole side of ensuring that companies are heading in the right direction and people are engaged and following along with what's needed most. So the Envision team is, of course, we've been working in multiple industries. We've specialized both in the energy industry, airline industry. We also do work, of course, a considerable amount of work in healthcare and technology. And with that, Bob, we'll hand it over to you to cover off some of the other items.
Yeah, I would add, Pat, that we're not a huge organization. At the core of us, maybe 20 very experienced senior executives across energy, across healthcare, and across aviation. And what we're finding, as I mentioned earlier, the Envision Group is now partnering with Fieldstone, where Fieldstone provides financing and financing strategy. And as Pat likes to say, the Envision Group provides through leadership training, coaching, accountability, performance measurement, the insurance policy that the money delivers to the stakeholders. And as I've been working with energy firms, more and more the consideration of ESG comes up. In particular, as you probably have noted, Andel, there are literally several trillions of dollars now in various big private equity funds who are all saying we require you, Mr. or Ms. potential client, to have a well-articulated ESG strategy in execution. And if you don't have that, well, worst case, we're going to charge you more for capital, or excuse me, best case, and worst case, we're not going to do business with you. So it's becoming real.
Dr. Hugh, do you have anything to add on to that?
No, I except to just re-emphasize what Bob said. We believe regulations will become increasingly more strict as we move forward. And as I lead the airline or the aviation practice, we're seeing more and more countries starting to apply increased regulation and oversight, and particularly for an industry where you are emitting significant amounts of greenhouse gases. It's increasingly important for us to be on top of this issue and work with our aviation partners to see what mechanisms we can use to help have an ESG strategy in place, and then work with them to say, well, now how do we execute that strategy? And I think that's been a key role for us at Envision.
Great. Apologies, yes?
Yeah, sorry, one thing to add, if that's all right. I apologize for jumping in. It's interesting because our whole pursuit in both strategy consulting and the work Bob is doing, of course, on the financing side and the capital sourcing side, we have also merged as one last item. And Bob, I know you'll smile when I say this, but we merged in a number some time ago into the carbon credit part of the industry as well, because you look at ESG, companies are moving to become carbon neutral. And we had been giving some counsel advice and a little bit of consulting to different organizations in the field of carbon credits. And Bob, if you want to expand on that.
Yeah, it's especially in industries that are asset heavy and consume a lot of energy. And it's virtually impossible for these, I'd say, asset-heavy industries to, on their own, through various technology and efficiency improvements, get to zero carbon. So my clients, in particular energy clients, who may have a fairly significant budget to move towards zero carbon, carbon credits are always part of that strategy, just because you can't get on your own to zero. And as Pat said, we have a client partner who has a large stake on some original growth rainforests, and we're working with them to broker and include those carbon credits in the companies we work with as part of our strategy.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. And I think you guys have partially answered this question already, but why did your firm specifically decide to specialize in ESG training and consulting?
I'll start that one off and I'll hand it over to Hugh, especially on the airline side. But, it's interesting because, again, consulting with organizations for so many years, sustainability and safety, the capital E of ESG has been a huge item of focus both in the airline and the energy industry. We landed on ESG not as a matter of desire most recently. This has been something we've been focusing on for years. And of course, it's now evolved into the 3 letters of ESG, but it's of course called sustainability prior to that. Hugh, anything to add to that from the airline perspective and aviation perspective?
Yeah, no, a couple of points really. In the aviation space, of course, we are concerned about greenhouse gas emissions. And we also recognize that for the customers of airlines, as an example, they're also equally concerned about what we're doing to the environment. And so with our engagements with various airlines, we have observed an increasing focus on them to make sure that they did achieve a carbon neutral status within a certain time frame, not an easy challenge. They also recognize that when you start emitting gases at 35 to 40,000 feet, it has a much more deleterious effect on the environment. So airlines, we recognized, were certainly moving towards achieving some degree of offset for the carbon they're emitting as a natural consequence of their business. And they're integrating that into their overall business strategy. And any organization that is a significant generator of greenhouse gases and does not have a robust ESG strategy in place we'll run into serious problems, as Bob has identified earlier. So from an Envision point of view, engaging with companies early on, making sure the strategy is aligned with where their investment strategies are going. It's pointless buying old aircraft as an example with, let's say, inefficient engines, as opposed to investing upfront on more efficient engines, reducing their greenhouse gases from one approach, and then looking for ways to offset that to try and get to that much lower carbon footprint in their industry. So overall, it's a combination of not only the regulatory effects, but it's also conscious actions by airlines recognizing that they have a responsibility to reduce their carbon footprint, and then working with them to make sure every organization, every department in that organization is aligned and they understand why we're going down this path and how important it is to the sustainability of that organization.
Great.
So with that, I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks. And before we dive into the details, what does Envision's ESG training offer and do for participants at a high level?
Well, at a very high level, what we put together over the years, we put thousands of hours of research into the training and constantly updating. At a high level, what our training offers, it offers an understanding not just to the senior C-suite of an organization, but to the body of an organization. It offers background on what ESG is, because to many people, they're just hearing these these letters for the first time, these three letters. Now, we're offering background on what it is, why it's so important critically to all of the stakeholders that are involved. And the last part of it, which is the most critical part, is how can I as an individual contribute to our ESG journey, our ESG policies, and our ESG ratings.
Okay. Bob or Dr. Hugh, any additions to that?
Yeah, I would say, just based on my 40-year experience in the energy industry, I've lived through, I hate to admit, maybe 5 cycles, price cycles now. And every time, in the past 4 cycles, when the price of oil, became good and oil became profitable, there was a passing interest, I would say, in ESG. And then when the price went down, so did the interest. But our opinion is this time around, ESG is here to stay, regardless of the price of oil. It's the investment community, stakeholder community, the follow-on younger generations all place a great value on social responsibility. So we firmly believe that it's not going to go away, and companies need to deal with it and be proactive. Not a saying that has come up in a number of conversations with our clients is, you control the message, or the message will control you.
That's very wise words, yes.
And I can cite several major oil companies who are on the wrong side of that statement.
Oh.
Like, you may have seen watched the courtroom against Shell in terms of not moving fast enough on their ESG strategy. And then my alma mater, ExxonMobil, just had a shareholder revolt, and which was very unusual. And so activist shareholders who have a strong interest in ESG rallied some other large institutional investors, and were able to place 3 friendly board members on the ExxonMobil board. And that's certainly going to have a impact on the direction of their strategy. And occurred, to be honest, because if you look at ExxonMobil's stance on ESG and climate change up until now, it's been not very supportive, if you will.
Okay. Dr. Hugh, would you like to add anything in?
Yeah, I would just like to add, Bob hit the nail on the head. ESG is here to stay, and there's still a lot of work to be done for people to fully comprehend the scale and scope of what that means, and then pushing that understanding down through the organization so that everyone understands why this is so important to the long-term sustainability of the organization. So I'll hand it back there. I don't want to take too much time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I guess with all the bigger oil and gas companies, getting more involved, that would be a good example, I guess, to set, and it will be more of a roadmap for the rest of the companies to follow suit.
Yeah, exactly. Virtually every mid-size and large integrated oil and gas company has set a stake in the ground to have a zero carbon business by 2030, 2040, 2050. And particularly the large integrateds are devoting several billions of dollars each year as part of their strategy. Money that would have otherwise gone into developing additional hydrocarbons. And so they're setting at a very high level a strong, aggressive, integrated strategy that smaller companies can emulate, maybe partially, but they're good flag, or what the right word is. They're good leaders. Their policies and their strategies are something to look at and to learn from.
Great. So our followers on the ESG Oil and Gas Industry Group specifically would be interested in training for their own industry. But could you elaborate on who you deliver this ESG training to and what industries you're focusing on?
Well, once again, thanks for that question, Andel. It's the industries we're focusing on today. We are preparing to deliver ESG training for the airline industry. We're currently delivering ESG training for the energy industry and not just oil and gas. So today we have ESG training arranged through different industry associations. We're working currently in the United States with the Energy Workforce and Technology Council out of Houston. And we have participants in our ESG training. Actually, I think we're close to over 50 people in that training, the first round that they offered, which is outstanding. It's one of the most successful programs that the Energy Council in Houston has offered. Participants range from, they have members from different client companies, they have member companies, I should say, from across the United States into Europe and overseas into the Middle East. We're delivering as well up in the what's called the Bakken region of the United States, which is up in Bismarck, South Dakota, et cetera. But the North Dakota Petroleum Council is the other organization we're delivering through there. And if we zip back over to the western part of the United States, upper Northwest Texas, up in the Permian, out of Midland, Odessa, we're delivering ESG. Bob and I just came back from Midland from last week. We were delivering our ESG training for the Petroleum Professional Development Center out of Midland College. And of course, in Canada, I can't forget about us Canadians up north of the border here, where we're just finishing next Tuesday on the 22nd of June, the final session for our ESG training for the Petroleum Services Association of Canada. So there's a lot of acronyms in there, but it's something where, again, the interest is growing, and we're being asked to come back and deliver training, not just for the associations, but for private companies who want to get those the engagement of more individuals within their group involved in the topic. Anything to add to that, Bob?
No, I think the first wave of interest, as Pat described, Andel, is really what is ESG? And the energy industry knows E quite well, because that's always been a part of our business, is paying attention to how we treat the environment, water, air, land, etc. But S is less known. Social interaction, community support, and then governance has always been well understood at the board level, but governance is now changing such that boards who have chief risk or chief safety officers are now having ESG added to their portfolio.
Yes.
So the first wave has been help us understand what this is, and then as we finish the training that Pat talked about, we're now being asked by specific companies to come in and say, okay, help us define in detail what an operational strategy is for ESG.
And I believe it would be quite valuable to have the relevant associations on board to help deliver your training. Have you formed any specific strategic partnerships with industry associations?
Yeah, the industry associations that I just mentioned, there's the Energy Workforce and Technology Council. We formed a partnership with, we're actually under our 7th year of not just leadership training, executive training, but they've added both ESG, and the second topic they've added is inclusion and diversity, which is a component of the capital S of ESG. So, and again, the second most popular program for them, but combined between ESG and the IND, the Inclusion and Diversity Program for the Energy Council, we have over 100 people. Like, again, it's their most popular, 2 most popular programs. Other partnerships currently include, again, North Dakota Petroleum Council, the Petroleum Professional Development Center out of Midland, and up in Canada with the Petroleum Services Association of Canada. So each one of those industry associations on energy, we have participants coming through the training. And again, not just oil and gas, we have power transmission, we're looking at power generation, power utility companies, as well on the electricity side, of course, because of the focus on not just coal burning to create electricity, it's natural gas burning to create electricity now.
Okay.
And as part of those associations, and they are all working with their constituency to form or create a voice of that association to stakeholders on their approach and their strategy around ESG. So I know that each of the associations Pat talked about are beginning to put more structure. They all, I think, have lobbyists who are working on the industry's behalf, certainly in the US and in Washington.
Okay. I know most people will be wondering how long they will have to be out of the office for this type of training, or currently maybe not out of the office, maybe, just doing a Zoom meeting. Could you elaborate a bit on the length of the training and whether it's a once-off event or if participants will need a refresher course every now and then?
No, that's a good question as well, because the way we've structured the course is if a private company or if a company individually brings us in to do the training, we give them options. We can deliver it as 2 straight days, which quite frankly is always the optimal learning environment when you can immerse yourself in and just block the phones off and stay focused for a couple of good days. And plus, usually what we find is on the in-between day of a 2-day session, you get a little bit of that social time where you can really come together and have conversations about the topic and really make it not just it's almost an edutaining environment, not just educational, but slightly entertaining. So with some organizations during this whole period during the pandemic, we've separated for some of the other associations our 2-day training into 4 half-days so that we don't have our backsides welded into a chair all day, if you know what I mean. And so, it's interesting. It depends on the environment that different groups want. And we're in discussion with some individual companies who are hoping to do it 1 day here, 1 day there, so it's an assortment, but really the training itself should be 3 days long, to be straight. There's so much content to cover off. And as we put together our content, we're constantly refining with the help of the committees and the groups within the industry associations we're working with, because of the constantly changing environment of ESG. But to really have individuals consciously aware of the how, not just the what and the why, but of the how they can actually contribute. We have a series of exercises we take different participants in the training through so that they are equipped to do a 180 and help others within their organization understand and know not just what it is, why it's so important, but how they can contribute as well. So it's a pay it forward scheme in terms of training so that we can actually have others equipped to take this message forward.
So you're quite flexible in, just helping the company to fit in with whatever they require.
Absolutely. And specific areas of focus too. That carbon capture is a big thing for the energy industry. Now, the capital S, if you look at some of the measurement agencies that are out there, such as SASB, the new IIRC combination of SASB and GRI included in their CDP, et cetera. But when you're looking at the measurement areas of energy, SASB is only measuring 8 specific materiality items right now, and we're encouraging people to go beyond that and become world-class in their ESG reporting by including items both on the S and the G at a higher level and in a more rounded scope. And the aptitude and the interest in doing that is actually wide and deep, and it's very impressive to see that. Anything to add to that, Hugh?
No, I think the key point there is that I think Pat, you have said often, you can't manage what you don't measure. And as the ESG becomes more and more sophisticated and more regulations get applied, it's important that organizations not only understand why they need to do something. It's not a cost issue in many ways. In fact, in all ways, it's a sustainability issue. If your company is going to continue to thrive, it has got to have an ESG strategy in place. And when you give people the training, they start understanding, where does this fit into my overall business model? And I think that's the first step of understanding why it's important, and then working with them to help them implement a strategy has been a secondary component of what we do. So I think that's something where I think we can provide a lot of value just through the deep knowledge we have in ESG and helping them, as Bob said, to integrate that into their overall long-term business strategy. That's my perspective. But Bob, would you like to say anything?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head as well, Hugh. You know, when students come into our training, we give them a little pre-work. In fact, we're just doing that for the second set of students for the Midland College. And you come in with an understanding of or a written statement of your company's strategy. And then if you can find it, most companies now have a complimentary statement of their ESG strategy on their company website. So we ask students to come in with both, and then our approach is to link corporate strategy to the implications of ESG, and then define what does that mean. Not only it's already defined at the executive level, but how do you translate that down to the worker, you know, in the field or in the store, and what are the implications for them?
And that's quite important. I mean, I think up till a while back, it was more the C-suite level, you know, just board level, and not the whole company wasn't really involved. But that is becoming abundantly clear that everybody in the company needs to be involved and know what the bigger vision is. So I think you guys definitely help with that. Like you said, with the 180 degree, if they can go into their own company after the ESG training and be able to assist other people, that is really where I think that's a great benefit to have in the training. With ESG being quite a complex topic to understand and to implement, do you offer one-on-one support after the training to assist participants with specific questions that they might have about their firm's own ESG efforts?
And we most definitely do. And actually with the Energy Council, Energy Workforce and Technology Council, their program, we've built in one-on-one support by way of coaching, specific one-on-one coaching for the participants of that program. Hugh, Bob, myself, and the rest of our partnership through the Envision team. And we're spending time outside of the training just to ensure that we're helping cater the unique and authentic needs of each leader and organization to ensure that they've got the tools to move forward. And, just on that, Bob's talking about ESG strategy, which is critically important to every organization. The interesting part on strategy, Andel, is that in most organizations, and this is a statistic that has been researched and found, is that, strategy in most organizations is only clear, understood, and effective 2.5 layers down, including the C-suite. Layers of leadership down into any, and you look at multiple organizations, the large multinationals can have as many as 11 layers of leadership. And if your strategy is only clear, understood, and effective 2.5 layers down, you're in for it. And there's an opportunity within the bulk of that organization to engage, align, and create efficiencies that can be unheard of. Anything to add to that, Bob?
Yeah, and typically in any organization of size, it turns out that the middle managers are I'll use a geologic term, the impermeable layer. So strategy comes down and bounces off middle management. Good ideas come up from the field and they bounce off middle management. So a big part of our work is to break through that barrier to make sure strategy ripples all the way down, and then good ideas and clarity go back up. It's ExxonMobil, we used a phrase called a clear line of sight. And so that's what we try to establish, especially from the individual worker and small team level. So, which we've feels important. And one last comment is Pat cited a while back, a Harvard Business School study concluded that firms who have this clear line of sight generally outperform their peers by an average of 5% total shareholder return year on year. So it's definitely significant.
Yes. Great. Dr. Hugh, would you like to add anything on?
Yeah, I was just smiling to myself. I like Bob's comment about an impermeable layer. And the challenge is, regardless of the business you're in, if that strategy, the overall strategic direction of the company, is not well understood down through the organization, it just causes confusion, distrust across the organization, and a lot of wasted effort as people start doing things that are in opposition to each other as opposed to being totally aligned. With ESG being referentially a new area of focus by organizations, and because it's changing so quickly, it's going to take a lot of focus, not only in terms of understanding what ESG is really about, but in making sure that it is understood through the organization. That will be a major advantage. If the companies can get that organized, it will make a big difference to how they perform, as Bob has just said. I think it's going to be critical for organizations not only to pass through that impermeable barrier, but to get everyone aligned that ESG is a fundamental requirement of organizations going forward.
Definitely, can't agree more. And since I started this ESG journey specific to the oil and gas industry, I've been chasing down a rather elusive answer, which I hope you can answer for me today. Does your training connect specific activities to each category of the 3 ESG pillars, being environmental, social, and corporate governance, that allows them to improve that specific category?
Well, you know, Bob, if I can jump on that and then I'll hand it over to you. It's interesting because really there's 5 categories, within ESG. If you look at the SASB, I believe they call them dimensions, but the 5 dimensions of SASB. So what we touch on is each one of them. There's governance and business ethics. There's climate change and energy. There's environment. Third, number 4 is really safety, health, and security. You look at what happened to Colonial on the security side in the southern United States with that hack taking down their pipeline system. And the final, number 5, but not of less significance, is social. And I know that SASB, they categorize their dimensions as leadership and governance, and same thing modeled there: business model and innovation, environment, human capital. Number 4 is, and number 5 is social capital. So when we actually look at each one of the items of materiality, we're constantly researching the most popular, and not the standard and the norm in terms of materiality. We're starting to really research leading edge items of materiality that companies are being recognized and applauded for. And currently we've got 42 different topics under those 5 categories. And the one that's loaded up the most is social, and that's the one that's not being measured by SASB today. And Bob, anything to add to that?
Yeah, and if I add maybe some, I think you were asking for some maybe specific examples of where an ESG strategy has impact or value generation. So social, in the energy industry, a big part of social is how do you interface with the local community, where you're doing business, where you're drilling wells, where you're building pipelines. And in our industry, we call it the right to operate. And I think the best example of, it's all public domain, so I don't mind chatting about this, is you may be familiar with the long history of the Keystone Pipeline, which is a large pipeline to carry Canadian heavy oil down to the US refineries in the Gulf Coast. And as you may have noted, last week, TransCanada Pipeline canceled that project. And largely because of, in my opinion, not having a very coherent, effective, forward-leaning strategy to bring the stakeholders into the approval process and gain their consent. So it's really important on the social side. And On the positive side, if you in the Permian, there's a group of I think about 20 producers who have come together, established a $100-200 million fund to help the local communities build out infrastructure, schools, fire stations, emergency response, and by doing so, you know, they're gaining consent and support of the local community. So that's very important. Again, we call it the right or the license to operate, and that's the you know, the consent of the communities that we impact. Very important.
Well, and Bob, to add to that, it's interesting because when we were in the Petroleum Professional Development Center at Midland College last week, one of the items of conversation during our training made by one of the members of our program, the participants, is that the energy industry largely, you know, I think the volume of investment that comes from the oil and gas industry into sustainability and technology to improve the environment is really not touted and talked about enough. And it's interesting because the oil and gas industry, you know, on the energy side, has largely been an industry and a sector that just hasn't really touted what it is that they're doing well enough. And I think if the world truly knew what was happening in terms of technology, investment, and innovation coming out of that industry, I think the world would be surprised at what's happening to have responsible development and responsible industry.
Yeah. And so we talked about what I call the right to operate by having good relationships with and buy-in from the local communities whom we operate with. And, you know, a bad example is what happened to the Keystone Pipeline. A good example is we, Envision, have a client in Canada who is a large Indigenous construction company, and we're working with them on strategy and funding for them to help improve through their business the daily lives of a large population of First Nations in Canada. So that's another example of positive impact.
I've received quite a few opposing answers to my next question. And I think, yeah, Bob, you did mention earlier that it is quite difficult for a company to achieve this. Is it even possible for an oil and gas company to achieve a good ESG rating?
Well, why don't you go ahead with Bob with that, Bob, and I'll follow you up.
Yeah. Well, yeah, absolutely. You know, it's about, as Pat or Hugh said, first of all, you have to have measurement systems in place. And so on the E side, it's very easy to put in place a plan and measurement and reporting such that air emissions, carbon emissions, water spillage, water usage, what else? Land impact. You can all put very specific goals in place and demonstrate progress, which the energy industry has been pretty good at because that's always been core to our business. On the social side, similarly, some energy companies are very, very good with community involvement and impact. But again, you can put performance measurements in place, dollars spent, schools built, roads repaired, and measure and demonstrate progress. And then at the governance side, a little squishier, but changing the governance model at the board level, where you actually designate someone, a chief ESG and safety and environmental officer, which firms are beginning to do. And so that then puts a high-level governance over everything, coordinates reporting, and then, you know, holds executives and down to individuals accountable for performance. There are a number of energy firms, I don't have their names in my head, who have now made part of ESG performance a measured element in bonus programs.
Yes, I saw that, yes. That should be quite a great addition. It's going to push
Yes,
them to adapt very quickly. Thanks, Pat. I believe you wanted to also add on to that.
See, again, you've got the top level executives in most companies, and when it comes to execution and really winding the concept of ESG into the culture and the fabric of an organization is an interesting concept. And what's interesting is, as you look at organizations, again, we'd mentioned that 2.5 layers of strategy effectiveness for most organizations. It's interesting because looking at anything below, you've got the C-suite of most organizations, you've got SVP or AVP, then VP. What's interesting is when you have an approach in place within an organization to have that bottom-up engagement and feedback and input on some of the objectives for an organization, whether it's ESG strategy or anything else. Bob's talking about the multiplier effect that can really be created when you have that bottom-up engagement of ESG input and actions and behaviors come from that, from some of the people that might even be boots on the ground right up to the C-suite. Bob, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think if you have an awareness at the operational level, then it changes how people act. I use another negative example, Endil, is in the Bakken, which is one of the big U.S. shale plays. There's a story about a field hand who had a tanker load of salt water because the wells there produce a lot of salt. Now, you should take that, if you're following process, you take that tanker of salt water to a disposal well and you inject it deep into the earth. Well, it was late in the day. This individual was in a hurry to get home. He just pulled over to the side of the road and dumped it in a ditch. And of course, guess what? The salt water just spread out into a farmer's field, destroyed a large number of acres. It cost the operator several $100,000 to remediate. So that's the kind of stuff that can be avoided by just a clear understanding of each individual, each worker's responsibility for a firm's ESG strategy.
Well, and it's sorry to jump in on this, but I'm just passionate about this as well as the sense. Bob, we heard this term come out in multiple training sessions for ESG, but if you don't cascade strategy beyond that 2.5 layers, I think the term is called greenwashing, isn't it, Bob?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sure you've heard that, Andel, where you make unsubstantiated claims about your ESG strategy, but they're just unsubstantiated claims, right?
Just for the brand image.
Exactly.
Absolutely. And then you look over in the airline industry, to bring Dr. Hugh back into the conversation. One of the other items of jest that was put out there recently within some of the sessions we've been running. I don't think too many of us that are flying and hopping back on aircraft are going to be comfortable jumping on a solar powered jet through any of the major providers. So, it's interesting because every flight that happens, Hugh, has a carbon footprint each time an aircraft takes off. And it's interesting because that carbon footprint does need to be offset and technology in place to begin measuring so that we can manage that more effectively. Anything to add to that?
No, you're correct, Bob. I mean, the airlines are working hard to have technology offsets, and you see continuous work by both aircraft manufacturers and engine manufacturers to drive improvements in efficiency. The challenge for the engine manufacturers, of course, which are generating the emission gases, is that the only way to make these engines even more efficient than they are today is to make them bigger, so they get more flow of air that don't actually go through the burn chamber. However, that has physical implications for the design of the aircraft and how high they are, how tall the undercarriage is, etc. But what we are seeing is that those tend to be longer term issues about next generation aircraft, etc. But what you're seeing now is airlines currently typically using voluntary mechanisms, so that when you're making your booking for an airline, it will come up on the more advanced airlines. Would you like to make a contribution to offset your carbon footprint? There'll be calculators on the system to determine just how much greenhouse gases you're emitting, and then what a typical offset might be. and then they're making it voluntary for the consumer to purchase that offset, again, as part of their social responsibility. I see that as a great first step, but it's only the first step. Eventually, as governing authorities and national governments start putting into place stricter and stricter rules, those carbon offsets will become mandatory, and the airlines will be forced to put in processes which will ensure that everyone is offsetting their share of the carbon footprint. And of course, that's one of the challenges that we face in all industries is as we go down the supply chain from the, let's say, the generator of the oil to the actual consumer of that energy source. How do we make sure that everyone contributes their fair share along the entire supply chain? So airlines will be looking at that in terms of the actual final usage of the fuel, but I think you're going to see that have to be implemented at all stages down the supply chain. That is a very complex challenge, and Bob, you probably have more insights on that from the energy side, but I'll pass it back to you. Everyone is going to have to take their fair share of offsetting their carbon footprint.
Yeah, that is a very complex issue. You know, who owns the carbon, who's accountable for the carbon, and I know we're watching with the new U.S. government maybe having warmer relationships with the rest of the world. I know a topic of discussion, Andel, is what about border carbon tax, right? So, in that, don't know how that's going to progress yet, but if it does, you know, that's going to be, as Hugh said, an enormous element of complexity that gets added to the supply chain and the carbon emissions considerations associated with the supply chain.
Since I've been following ESG and also, you know, researching in the background, it seems in the past the largest selling point for ESG has been to position your company to be an attractive option for investors. But are investors still actively investing in oil and gas companies?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting, Andel, from that perspective, the investment community, of course, you heard around the Christmas period in December that the Rockefeller Foundation is divesting of carbon-related interests. You know, it's interesting. Back when, of course, when the investment wasn't as attractive, you know, a year ago, we saw the price of oil melt and go into the negative territory for the first time in history. And of course, you look at when the investment's low, you're not going to have investors jumping into the game. What we're seeing now at $72 oil today, if it's still there when I checked the price with the markets when I first woke up, what's interesting now is $72 oil. You've got interest in different pockets from investors. Now, there's different types of investors. Of course, institutional investors are one. There's you know, the high net worth crowd that are out there, sovereign wealth funds. There are still investors interested in carbon, you know, in the carbon-based industries that are out there, because of course, we're still driven, as much as people think we want to be carbon free by a certain period. You know, the world is still driven not in a huge part, but largely by carbon related energies. And so investors will still be coming into the game. There's going to be more scrutiny on investment by way of ESG, with the responsibility factors coming into the play. Now, it's interesting because I don't think investment, there's some that are shying away from it, but largely around the world, there still is interest, and we're seeing it growing as the price of oil increases. Anything to add to that, Hugh?
I think you hit it correctly, Bob. There are still organizations and funders that are definitely very much interested in the energy industry, but the scrutiny that they will apply to ensure that they don't destroy their own brand by working with companies that have a robust ESG strategy in place, that will just become more forefront in their consideration. So having that ESG strategy in place will certainly be required if you are going to encourage investment in your specific company, industry, etc. So it's still there, but be prepared for additional scrutiny on your overall sustainable business strategy.
And that makes sense. Seeing that you guys are in the thick of all things ESG, how important is it for an oil and gas company to focus on their ESG strategy? And what are the dangers of completely ignoring the ESG movement?
Oh, that's an excellent question. And that actually came up in our training last week as well, and was addressed not just by us, but by the participants of our training. One of the organizations that was in there, they were talking about their access to capital. And, companies that are searching for equity or for capital to, grow, to attain assets, to even potentially look at merging with other organizations and acquisition. What's happening is the cost of capital is going to start to increase for those that are ignoring it. So it's going to be more expensive to access any capital for the company's purposes. So that's one item. Now, it's interesting because, as companies move forward, the organizations that are starting to really put into play ESG strategy, policy, and engaging multiple people in what they're doing are truly the organizations, as Bob had mentioned early on. When Bob talked about the organizations that are more competitive, to the tune of strategy and ESG engagement, organizations are starting to see that they're becoming more profitable and more efficient, just because of the fact that they've engaged their people around this whole. So it's not just the access to capital; it's also the efficiencies the one organization could attain if they're actually focusing in on responsible development, responsible business.
If I could just add a comment there, Pat. It's also when you're trying to recruit the best people into your organization, with new generations entering the workforce as well, you've got to take into account what are the goals and objectives of those individuals? What sort of companies do they want to work for? So if you're going to attract the best talent into your industry, your organization, I think it's going to be imperative that
Definitely
you have a societally focused strategy. I just think it's the overall business strategy of an organization must include ESG, but it cannot be a paper exercise. It must be followed through and executed. So I just wanted to emphasize that we saw people talking to us that they said they had an ESG strategy, but when you started looking at it in depth, there wasn't much there. So I don't think that's sustainable. With new governance coming into place, you better have metrics in place, and you better be able to report robustly on how well you're performing.
And I think
and not to put the fear into companies. This is a topic of passion for many because look what happened to Blockbuster Video. Look what happened to Kodak. Organizations these days that are not looking at paying attention to the ESG discussion and the ESG items that are out there. I think they're the organizations, quite frankly, that will be left behind. And so for organizations today that aren't focusing on, the E, environment, the S for social, and the G for governance, if you're not paying attention and engaging the people of your organizations on this topic, I'm sad to say that organizations that choose to not look at ESG will slowly be left behind.
Definitely. Do you think it's possible for companies to keep their ESG reporting efforts in-house? I mean, it is such a complex process, and you guys are offering training and hoping for them to take it back to their own offices and, disperse the information. But is it not too complex and time-consuming to do everything in-house? Do you need that consultant to come in and, run it for you?
Well, that's a very good question, because what happens is the training that we're offering today, Andel, will help an organization lead this internally on their own very well. Thank you very much. The interesting thing is that many organizations are choosing to work with a tour guide to help them to initiate their ESG journey. And at some point, it's got to become something that is self-propelling. And when you look at like what we're doing right now, it's not just ESG strategy. If you've done your certification in project planning and you've done your what's called your PMP, your project management professional certification, you always start off a project with a charter. We call it a playbook. And when you develop your ESG playbook and you continue to have a process of revisiting, it becomes an evergreen process. And what a great term in terms of ESG, but it becomes an evergreen process of ensuring that you have a mechanism of revisiting built into the culture of your company so that you're constantly evolving and enhancing your ESG journey.
Great. Dr. Hugh, would you like to add anything on?
Yeah, I see ESG evolving in the same way for an organization as does marketing, sales, operations, finance, etc. Yes, I think we will see consultant organizations providing a lot of input at the start. And even as we go forward, in the same way that marketing may bring in some outside resources to help them through a certain period of time or to help them develop their strategy. I think the same type of activities will work on ESG, but it is important that there's a fundamental knowledge base within the organization that understands ESG. Otherwise, you don't know who you're engaging and for what reasons. So I still think there'll be a role for consultants going forward, but I believe it's also fundamentally a requirement for an organization to have their own internal team responsible for the ESG aspects of their business.
And to make sure they drive it forward continually.
Absolutely.
Well, Andal, it's interesting because the industry associations are pulling together ESG committees and groups to help guide the topic and guide the enhancements that are needed within any one industry. Within an organization, we encourage, even through our training, the creation of an ESG task force or committee that's is multidisciplinary, that actually has the topic looked at from the different interest groups within an organization, and even stakeholders and partnership outside of the organization. So it's a topic that needs to be voiced from multiple angles, and that's part of what we help organizations do. And the interesting thing, again, back to your original question of, is this something that organizations can grow and sustain on their own? It's nice to have somebody help you get the engine started, but once it's started, you can have it running on your own.
Okay, great. We did briefly touch on this earlier. What are your thoughts on having one standard ESG reporting methodology that governs the entire oil and gas industry?
Oh my goodness, yeah, Hugh, that's an interesting one, isn't it? There's so many measurement agencies that are out there.
Yes.
You look at organizations, like, it's interesting. I was just reading Schlumberger. They've got a fantastic ESG report available online, and they're utilizing multiple sources of measurement so that they're addressing different angles. We've got the combination of all the different measurement agencies now into this the value-based reporting, with SASB and the IIRC. We also have the TCFD, which is the outcomes of the Paris Accord, with the 17 items that they had come up with, that I know Schlumberger is looking after and addressing the majority, if not all of them, close to all of them, I should say, whereas other organizations are just starting to lightly touch on it, because many of the items out of the Paris Accord really hit on the capital S of ESG. So I'd say if you're looking at just one method of measurement, you might be missing out.
I can add to that, Pat, just from my experience of looking at international rules and regulations. Trying to get different national governments to agree on a standard reporting is a nightmare. And even if it works, let's say in Europe, it won't be quite the same in North America, and it'll be a little bit different in, let's say, Southeast Asia, etc. And maybe one country decides, we're going to advance our rules and regulations at this pace, whereas another region may do it at a slightly different pace. And then you automatically create different types of metrics. So it would be nice if we get to a single consistent metric, but we can't even get the world to agree on a consistent standard for RF tags for suitcases. So they're all over the place. And I suspect it won't be much different in the ESG space. So be prepared for that, which means depending on the scope and scale of your operations and the size of your company, you may be required to have a different reporting standards depending on which national agency you're reporting into. Again, that just adds to complexity, but that's what life is like in the modern business world. So be prepared for it. Assume that you will have more than one reporting standard to adhere to. And even if it's just one, let's say in North America, you'll probably have a different standard in Europe versus Asia. It's just life. Life has a way of throwing things at you just to make it more complicated.
Well, I guess like Pat said, it might be initially to get a consultant, an ESG consultant on board to just start the engine. They will help you, to kind of like see, where you're going to fit in, and then you can just keep it running, and that will make it easier to not constantly think, oh, should I be, using that methodology or that methodology. Once you get it running, you will have a roadmap.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly correct. And as part of that roadmap, plan for, hey, the requirements in this region of the world is this, but we're set up for it. We know what those are, so we'll report according to those standards. It's just like having different accounting standards in different parts of the world. Be prepared for it. Have a template that you work to, and then make sure you stay up to date on any changes in each one of those jurisdictional areas.
Well, you know, it's interesting, Andel. We always say within our Envision team, you know, business is really easy, isn't it, Hugh?
Until you introduce.
Until you introduce people. You know, and it's
Exactly.
interesting because, you know, once you introduce people, even two people, now you have to be an organization, and organizations need to be organized. And that's why we actually approach the whole topic of ESG to say, build your ESG playbook, which is like your project charter for ESG, and ensure that you have the components of a playbook, which we actually give out in our training, so that everybody's on the same page, because nothing
Yes.
is real until it's written, right, Hugh?
That's absolutely correct. Having that playbook will be fundamental. Then you'll know where I need to pay attention, what are the metrics associated with that aspect of ESG, and then where is the accountability? Because that's the other issue, making sure that someone knows that they're accountable for not only tracking it, but they've also got the right contacts in the different areas of the organization that may be sources of the generation of that particular emission, gas, societal responsibility, governance, oversight, etc. Making sure they've got that playbook will be fundamental to staying on top of the ESG issues that will continue to change and arise as we go through time.
Great. And if we bring technology into the conversation, increasingly it plays an important role in the oil and gas companies' operation. And in your opinion, what part does technology play in improving an oil and gas company's ESG score?
It's interesting, Andel, because looking at the energy industry, and Hugh, I know you can speak to the same question when it comes to the airline industry, but you know, of course, carbon capture is one thing. When you look at some of the capital E for GHG emissions, which is greenhouse gas emissions, you look at items where the technology right now, we know of one company that's actually digitizing not just the flow of paperwork from the field to the office, but they're digitizing the movement of people so they can track better ESG ratings and ESG scores just through geotracing people's movements, which is one really creative way of actually getting to some of the measurement of materiality items. Another one, I know another company that's actually, they're taking big diesel trucks that are rolling down the highway that have the two diesel tanks on either side. One side is now diesel, the other side is now natural gas, and there's a mixture to offset emissions. You know, technology, you know, digital transformation and business transformation is a big topic these days. And when you look at the technologies that are coming out, you know, to really measure and reduce the carbon footprint within the energy industry, I think it's in the billions of dollars of investment that's going into technologies to offset emissions. And again, that's part of the conversation that's not being touted in the energy industry and even made public. It's something that's, you know, again, oil and gas companies with the technology and the innovations they're coming out with do need to start tooting their own horn a little bit more of what they're actually doing. And that's something that, you know, the investment into technology continues to increase, but we just need to tell the story better. And Hugh, I know on the airline industry, the story is the same, you know, measurement of carbon coming out of engines is an example of that, right?
Absolutely. The use of alternative fuel sources that are more sustainable, etc. I suspect that there'll be a lot of interest for research companies to invest in new technology for looking at alternative means. I suspect there'll be other people looking at, well, how do we capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it in some of the unused domes that we have under the ground from, let's say, expired oil wells, gas facilities, etc. I think there's a lot of work to be done, because the challenge is you need to be able to not only capture it, but then transport it to places where it can be stored safely and securely, etc. And so there will be costs involved, but I think there's a lot of scope for whenever the needs become at a sufficient level, or the costs become high in terms of fines or penalties or restrictions on how you operate, someone will put their mind to, okay, what do we do to address this? And the more urgent the need, the more urgent the attention for the scientists to come up with better technologies. I don't think we've scratched the surface yet. I know there's a lot of work going on, but I believe that we have a path ahead of us to do a lot more research.
You know, a while back I did an interview with a company that provides services to oil and gas companies, and one of their offerings, they have predictive technology, pipeline integrity software. Could that directly improve your ESG score? I asked them that question, and they seem to think that it could, but they couldn't give me a specific answer. It was more just it was helping them to report more easily. That was where the offering was. But to mitigate the risk of a pipeline bursting, is there a direct improvement for your ESG score in that?
Well, it's interesting. I think we have to first look, Andal, at baselining the data that we're actually looking at, because of course with integrity software, yes, it'll improve the risk to the environment if you're better able to detect the areas of risk in advance. So of course, if we can mitigate the rupturing of a pipeline so that we don't have an impact on the environment, that's a good thing. It really comes back to looking at the data. Most organizations, when we're starting the training, we even have a range of people that are well on their way in their ESG journey and others who are just getting started. When you're just getting started, if you're looking at the type of mitigation that you're speaking of now, you've got to start by baselining the data that you currently have and then working to improve it. So if there's no improvement, of course, the ESG rating may be impacted by a flat line result year over year. But if you do have a method of actually baselining the data, like the first step is just know where you're starting. If you don't see the forest through the trees, start to understand your numbers so that you can set the areas and of course set the budget to impact the areas that are of most relevance and of most significance, so that you can continue forward and improve your ESG scores, which will improve your ESG rating.
Okay. And I think the same then applies to a SCADA system. For instance, the ability to remotely shut down a pipeline to prevent an oil and gas leak, that then it would be the same. There has to be a baseline for you to be able to, make a difference and improve your ESG score.
Yeah, absolutely. Like SCADA systems that are out there today, and you've got the evolution of better technology when it comes to controlling flow within a pipeline. And you look at even the Colonial example, where again the technology that improves flow, you've also got to mitigate the risk of somebody hacking into your system to impact those systems as well. But you look at it, today the technology continues. Like we're seeing technology advance faster than our great grandparents did when the advent of the steam locomotive came into play. And of course, they got to see that. They got to see airplanes after the Wright brothers started flight. Technology is advancing these days, weekly faster than it did within a decade. So we've got advancements that are coming to improve. Now, as you baseline and as those technologies come up, we're going to see an advancement in ESG ratings from companies that are staying focused on it. And again, looking at some of the leading organizations that are looking at measuring what it is that needs to be managed. My advice to people would be read some of those ESG reports, look at what they're measuring, understand as much as possible the advancements that are being made, and if need be, begin guiding your organization towards ensuring that you're making the similar advancements for the betterment of our society and the industries that we're all in. But the baselining is critically important so that we can move ahead, and then the observation of technologies that can help each one of us move forward helps us measurably move forward in the right direction. But the odd organization that takes a lead role in something new and maybe not so leading edge, but maybe even bleeding edge, are the ones that I've got a lot of respect for, because if they're taking that lead role in the industry to improve ESG scores through technology, I applaud them for it. Hugh, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think you kicked off the first point. If you know where you are today and you've got an ESG strategy in place, what's the vision for that ESG strategy? Where do you want to get to? So if you know where you are and you know where you want to get to, then you can set some goals and objectives in place to deliver. When you look at your organization and you look at how you operate, what your production items are, where there's risk to the organization in terms of ESG aspects, now you can start focusing your attention on where you're going to get the biggest payback. And that's where you work first. The other areas, some areas may be incredibly complex, but the incremental benefits to your organization may be small. They still have to be addressed at some stage, but always go for where you can have the biggest impact the soonest. That's what will overall impact your ESG score. So as Pat said, you need to have the right metrics in place, and then you need to have the right monitoring tools to ensure that you stay within those guidelines. So with that being said, I think we're only scratching the surface. I think there's a lot of opportunity for research and development. Technology will always play an important role in addressing issues.
Mm.
My insight there.
Thank you. And I think if we look at the other side of the coin then, if you do have an oil spill or a gas leak, how badly does that affect your oil and gas company's ESG score?
Well, it can hit you pretty hard. You know, again, if it's proven to be something that was an oversight or something that wasn't paid attention to, it can be even worse. But looking at the ESG ratings that are out there today, one thing to say: if you go into the SASB materiality map and you click on the specific items that are being measured for greater than 50% of the addressable companies within one given sector, they mark them out that way on their materiality map. When you click on the item of materiality, they give you the physical measurement items that are being looked at. And if your organization isn't paying attention and being proactive in measuring those items, your score is at risk. I think is a direct way of answering that question. So keep an eye on those materiality items, the items that, as an example, just as even to get started, that SASB is physically looking at for measurement, and ensure that your company's proactive on measuring those items.
And I think you hit the key point there. If it's something that could have been avoided, someone didn't pay attention, the brand damage to your organization is incredibly severe, and it happens very quickly. Just look at the impact of Boeing on their Boeing 737 MAX after the 2 crashes. Wiped, I think, about $100 billion off their stock market price. So, and yet it was something, and then the other issue is that they didn't pay attention. They weren't seriously enough focused on, we need to fix it. So they started coming out with statements that it'll be fixed in just a month or 2. It's just a software fix. Well, the aircraft was on the ground for more than a year before they finally got it operating again. That's where communications are important as well. You need to get on top of the program, but as an organization, if something has gone wrong, you need to own it. And it is far more efficient for you as an organization to own it, fix it, and put some correct information out there, as opposed to puffing smoke saying, yeah, it's not a big deal, it's not a big deal. I think BP experienced the same thing with the issue in the Gulf. Get on top of the program, own it, and then put a concrete plan in place to address it.
In your opinion, the most critical factors that oil and gas companies need to address to make sure they're at the forefront of the energy transition?
Hugh, I'll start that off if you don't mind.
Okay.
After. You know, it's interesting, Andel, because looking at oil and gas industries again that want to stay at the forefront, you know, quite clearly, look at the Paris Accord, the 17 items that came out of the Paris Accord with TCFD, and you look at even the materiality items. If you're an oil producing company, there's 8 items today that are focused on for materiality for producing companies. And about a month and a half ago, it was only 7 items for oil and gas servicing companies. Today, it's 8. Now, our suggestion is do not stop at just the bare minimum for focus on materiality. Go as far beyond that as your budget and time and resources will allow, and encourage the voice of the electorate of your organization to really participate in creating action and behaviors around those materiality items. You know, create your strategy, have your ESG plan well set, and engage people around that, because that is how you become an organization that is leading, not bleeding, in terms of ESG. Anything to add to that, Hugh?
No, I think you covered it correctly. Don't do the absolute minimum, but look for where the opportunities are. ESG is as much about your brand and your reputation of your company as it is about the actual technology itself. Yes, I think it's incredibly important that we have a robust ESG strategy in place, but also reflects the responsibility and the brand of the organization. So do you want to be just another Me Too company, or do you want to be a leading company? And I think that will differentiate organizations from how much effort they put into ESG and how big an impact it has on them.
Yeah, and just to punch this home, the training that we actually are conducting internationally is guided towards creating the leading company, not the Me Too. And that's something we're quite proud to say. And participants who have come through and graduated from our ESG training today are well on their way to do just that. And it's so it's such a great thing to see from different organizations, right, Hugh?
Absolutely. Couldn't say it better, Pat. So
I do have a last question that I've just thought of. Would you encourage for one company to have participants of different levels in the company to kind of like, cover, to make it easier to discuss it in, when they're going back to the company, a C-suite level, and then at a manager level, and then maybe, somebody that's on the ground? Would it be, maybe a good idea to have different participants from one company like that?
Absolutely. And Hugh, it's interesting because the organizations we've worked with, even the ESG committee or task force that you have internally within your organization, don't just pack it with a bunch of executives, get the voice from different areas of the company heard. When you actually have that representative group of people from different levels and areas of the organization, the voice widens and the results become wider and deeper.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. Someone has to be held accountable. If there's an accountability issue, then people pay attention to it. If it's just yet another committee that we all get absorbed into on a daily and weekly basis, then you won't make much change or progress in your organization. But if someone is held accountable and has to report to the executive team on a monthly, quarterly basis, etc., that will only work if it is translated down through the organization, down to where the rubber hits the road. That's where you're going to have the metrics in place. It's got to be escalated back upwards in regular management reporting. And once you hold people accountable for performance issues, people pay attention. So I couldn't add that, as I could only say that's going to be fundamental. If you want to make ESG successful, hold someone accountable for delivering those reports on a regular basis.
You can't manage what you don't measure, and what gets recognized gets repeated at a higher level.
Yes.
Thank you so much, guys. I've learned a lot. I'm sure our audience, our followers, are going to love it. So anything else that you would like to add that you've just had in the back of your mind and I didn't ask the right question?
I think we've covered some ground here today, and we've covered some great ground. Andal, I'd love to stay in contact with you as the weeks and the months go by, because this whole ESG topic is changing so fast. Yes. That the advancements and and really the changes in the items of differentiation, they continue to come. We've got our full team researching and staying on top of as much as we can. And quite frankly, it's something that we think ESG is going to look radically different in another 12 months. Right. And so to keep in contact with one another and just to make sure that we're on top of the items that are important to organizations is what we do. And we're happy to come back to you and actually report back on some of the changes we've seen even beyond today.
I think that's great. Maybe even, quarterly, let's have a quarterly meeting maybe, or a quarterly interview. And yeah, so our followers can expect it and look forward to knowing about all the changes. I think that's a great idea. Thank you.
Regan, thank you so much for inviting us onto your call today. It's our pleasure and privilege to be speaking with you about this wonderful topic of ESG. So thank you for having us.
Thank you. It's always nice to chat to people that are really genuinely fired up and passionate about this topic. So, and you guys definitely are. So thank you so much. I'm feeling fired up again as well.
All right. Thank you, Andal.
Great.
Okay. Until next time, we'll hope to see you soon.
Awesome.
Okay.
Thanks, guys.
Take care. Stay safe. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.